think one of the important things to remember about e-commerce and things that we've been pushing throughout this series of talks is that e-commerce affects all aspects of business. E-commerce is about allowing suppliers to get together with consumers and to make products and to make deals and to allow an exchange of goods and services, normally for money, occasionally for other things. And it's very important to do that. However, as part of this, therefore, it's important to remember that the entire supply chain, the physical product supply chain, is influenced by e-commerce. And although we look at the supply chain as a physical product, you should be aware that even non-physical products have supply chain issues and have part elements that are part of the supply chain in it. So it's important to remember that. One of the key things to remember about this whole system, of course, is that within any supply chain, the ultimate value comes in terms of the consumer. The consumer puts all value into the supply chain. Okay, any other value that you see in the supply chain, there is not there. It must eventually come from the consumer if the supply chain is profitable. That's the only if. If the supply chain is unprofitable and somebody's putting money in elsewhere, then effectively you have a business that is not stable long term. So if you have a long-term stable business, then all the value comes from the consumer. So if we look at it here, you'll see the consumer is positioned at this end. Yeah. Right, simple and straightforward. And going up this way, we have from the consumer, we have long-term plans improvements, individual orders, payments, etc. And if you look at this thing, that's the only place you'll see payments. Okay, you'll see payment requests down here, but you won't see payments anywhere else. The idea is that down the supply chain come products and services, new products and services, delivery information, payment requests, offers of credit. Up the supply chain, we've got long-term plans, market research, individual orders, payments, and suggestions for new products and services. One of the differences we have, though, is that here, in the modern supply chain, using e-commerce, we'll note the consumer can reach into the different parts of the supply chain and talk to different parts of the process. This makes the situation far more complicated for the end business to deal with it. But it's also important to say why e-commerce is one of the reasons why e-commerce is majorly disruptive, as well as like the packaging of various things. So it's a very important issue to take apart. So look at that, it's very important that the reason we think it's supply chain management is there are various elements such as purchasing supply, physical management, logistics, etc., which can be operates things. So purchasing supply operates this small part when you're buying in, and physical distribution the part you're selling out. Logistics controls this area all the way down here, so you can see how far you're getting down towards your producers. Materials management is these two put together there. But the big thing, supply chain management covers everything, and like we've just said, all value in a profitable supply chain is coming from the consumer, and all profitable supply chains think that. Therefore, it's important to recognise that the information from the consumer, which can now go to various parts of the thing, can have a major impact on whether or not a supply chain is successful. So it's an important issue to think about it from this point of view. And e-commerce's ability to disrupt the supply chain by allowing the consumer not to be reliant on simply reporting up the historical lines, up through look at the historical lines up through the circular things here, and actually information flows down this way. But actually, the consumer, the different aspects of things can talk to the consumer can talk to different areas of the supply chain. So it's a fundamentally disruptive approach to supply chain. And so if we look at a classic typical supply chain, look at something like the toy supply chain, where you may have in one country, you may have tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, reaching to the manufacturer, who goes to exporter and then transports internationally across the border to an importer, to distributor, retailer, consumer, etc. But actually, coming up the other way, you have a brand owner passing on information to design and development, and passing the information to the manufacturer. This is a classic coming where the consumer actually has had very few limits. We're talking about something like a Harry Potter toy or a Star Trek toy or a Star Wars toy or something like that, where the brand owner is the one telling the people what they want to buy, and consumers just receive their products. Consumers are marketed to. However, the reality is a consumer in this supply chain could actually reach right back here and check out what's going on and talk to things like that. So they're fundamentally disrupting the traditional historical nature of the supply chain. Look at another example. We can actually notice that actually operational supply chains are much more complicated these days than they were before. Okay, say this sort of thing, red is quality risk from production, green is quality risk from operations, logistics operations, to explain the different background virtues towards it. So we could look at another example, for instance, operations network. Now, a plastic homeware supplier, somebody that produces kind of spatulas, bowls, perhaps the sort of thing, washing up bowls, that sort of thing, the basic plastic, low quality, mass produced items of that. Just to explain exactly what we mean by the supply chain. So they will have a series of things. They will have a first tier supplier who may well supply them with plastic stockists and packaging, etc. And they will communicate to the homeware manufacturer, who will communicate and put orders back there saying what they need. Then, so to be clear what we mean by second tier suppliers, the second tier supplier of plastics will be a chemical company which provides the chemicals that are used to produce the plastics. A packaging supplier will have a cardboard company and ink supplier. No, these may well be all part of the same company, so maybe they're not quite that, but we're basically bringing a general structure towards you. The other side, after you've manufactured, you can pass on to your first tier customer, be a wholesaler, which simply somebody takes the stuff, puts it in a warehouse and sells it on. And after that, we have a retailer. Note, even in the old style supply chains, the retailer may talk direct to the wholesaler, but some larger retailers may talk directly to the manufacturer doing that. So that's the way that the situation works, second tier suppliers. We then move that to a global scale. What do we have to talk about global scale? Managing extensive global supply chains has produced huge numbers of complications. I mean, one of the obvious things to talk about is the fact that substantial geographic differences have caused lead times and inventory investment. So effectively, if you're expecting to deliver things for, say, Christmas, you may need to order them months in advance. You may have them shipped from China, say, to Western Europe, and then you open up potential problems about how you could do it. Which can open up problems with forecasting. You're having to order for Christmas months in advance. Maybe you don't know where which toy will be popular. You then have problems of saying, oh, maybe the toys are on a ship, they're stuck on a ship somewhere. There could be problems on the price of doing it too cheap, because you might go too far in advance. You might end up trying to order, by getting a cheap order far in advance, you end up buying stuff you cannot sell. There are also issues with exchange rates can fluctuate. Inflation can be high, so there's an obvious opportunity for prices of hedging and insurance is required. And of course, in many developing countries where you might be getting production from, you could have infrastructure problems, lack of skilled labour, etc., scarce local material supplies. And this is information, if you remember, look at the supply chain, it's going up and down the supply chain to the end customer, telling us that this toy will not be available. Demand is coming up the supply chain of the end customer. And of course, what this may do is those end up with large numbers of products proliferated across the market, trying to customize products for each different market and shipping them and hoping you don't actually get your market shipping wrong. Get that. However, one thing you should be aware of is that supply chain management is extremely important. The winning firms have the best supply chain. And it's also important to point out that supply chains compete. It's not a case of individual firms competing in the modern business. Supply chains on the whole compete. So what will happen is that if you're part of a good supply chain, you will be successful, but all the value is coming into that from the end consumer. And if the supply chains start to struggle among themselves and argue among themselves about dividing up the value provided by the consumer, and that it seems to be not a fair amount for heading down the supply chain to different people who are contributing, then you will actually find things then will become very problematic. A supply chain that attempts to, a member of the supply chain, if you're dominant in your supply chain, attempts to squeeze your suppliers and maybe squeeze your interim customers before it reaches the end consumer, will start to say that people will leave the supply chain, people will not cooperate with the supply chain. The supply chain will start to struggle and fall about. Which is why, using e-commerce, many firms are moving towards increased use of electronic marketplace. And electronic marketplaces can vary. Simply somewhere you can go on and order all the products and supplies you need. Some are independently owned net marketplaces where they have large catalogues with over thousands of suppliers and say for spot purchase. You can see any example of these if you want to go onto the log and you're trying to buy marketed spot products. Simply the plastic products we spoke about before. You'll find there'll be thousands of suppliers who can do pre-produced stuff, or they can do design things that you can just go online and unlock. And these are often independently run. But e-purchasing, sometimes actually manufacturers will have required objective suppliers who will actually pay fees to join business during the market. They want to get involved with long-term contractual purposes. They want to get involved with companies that will come in and will take an order and not just come in and spot and say, oh, you'll have 500 of those, or order 500 of those every month for the next 2 years, for instance. So companies are very keen to get involved in this part of the supply chain. And exchanges, these are actually similar to e-distributors, but they're ones that focus on spot requirements of large firms. So they know that firms are going to need a lot of a certain type of item, but they're not sure which firms will need which. So there'll be so you'll look for very small numbers specifically. So it might be like large numbers of plastic tags. It might be large numbers of screws, for instance, of different sizes that are put into exchange, and then employers can reach in and buy these. What you're actually seeing here is a system where, in fact, you are actually getting a lot more control into the market. E-commerce is allowing you to interfere at points in the supply chain. In the past, you would have to have gone through intermediaries. Industry consult, industry owned market, so the industries may set up, companies may get together, and they will allow buyers to purchase direct inputs. They will try and find suppliers who are they consider to be high quality good suppliers, and they'll put forward elements like that too. So it's very important to realise that this, and this is ways in which we are actually getting a seriously disruptive influence into the supply chain. Okay, what therefore is this happening with the supply chain? Well, one thing we're seeing is decreased supply chain velocity. Because these huge lengths of the supply chain, we had greater uncertainty. We might have things like earthquakes, wars, piracy, terrorism. These are all things we've seen recently that do massively disrupted supply chains. Or ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal, a huge disruption. Nobody could plan for that. And this causes endless numbers of problems and struggles with things that people lose. Okay. This is also therefore good that this means the supply chain is becoming uncertain, unstable, and risks major disruption and major difficulties in the management of the supply chain. People are getting more environmentally conscious. People are more worried about this, things like this. The supply chains need to have control elsewhere, where people need to know what they're buying and where it's coming from, so that they can have confidence that what they're purchasing is ethical and properly produced. So there are quite a number of ongoing issues that we should talk about here, and it makes for some difficult decisions to be made by management, different management to think about, like organising these things. Yeah. So what does e-commerce offer the modern supply chain? Well, it was interesting as certainly things of it to interview people who've been involved in modern supply chains and ask them what e-commerce offers them. One of the things they offered is the speed. They focus on two components. Things change quickly, so it's the speed of change, but also the speed of decision making. If you're using e-commerce, you can get in touch with people, you can talk to them, you can make quick decisions. Another thing that was brought up by people actually active in the industry was that connectivity. E-commerce makes interaction and market access emerge as two components of connectivity. Nearly all respondents spoke of the network effect, being interconnected to their suppliers and customers via the internet. Customers are going to rely on the system-to-system connection with strategic suppliers and customers. You can talk to your people very quickly. E-commerce technology provides information and visibility throughout the supply chain. You can be more responsive to supply chain members due to the visibility of real-time data via the internet. You can find out what's going on. You can even, in some cases, link onto your suppliers' factories, link onto their production lines. You know if there's a problem before you have to wait for them to tell you. So this force of information transparency is so important in that. It's also a major thing that's changed, such as market structures. Fast-paced rapid e-commerce environment has new markets that impact traditional market structures. As we've noticed before, there are a number of new electronic ways of buying and selling, and a number of new specific electronic marketplaces beyond the traditional catalog-based way you'd actually perhaps talk to us and maybe have salespeople come out and talk to suppliers, etc. There are huge differences coming in supply chains here. The elements of uncertainty, the dynamism of markets, and increased information visibility is facilitated by the speed and connectivity of e-commerce present an uncertain environment. One respondent described the environment in the following quote: "In the internet space, it changes that we deal with the customers than deal with the suppliers. It's all very new to them and it's scary. No longer can I get up and go to work like I used to get up and go to work. I don't know what's coming down the path." Another one talks about the importance of stronger relationships. You've got to find ways to involve yourself and get them involved in our meetings so they understand that we start earning credibility with them so you can take them to that collaborative thing. They're not going to do anything unless they trust you. So the internet can help us with accurate data. You know if there's zero defect transactions, you start earning credibility with customers, and you're really not going to be able to establish a collaborative relationship until you do. Companies also realise the importance of this for international business. When we said entering South American market and entering the Asian market, we're going to have some strong strategic alliances, some strong partners who are doing business with those markets successful. Strategic alliances are a strong component of dealing with the problems that e-commerce brings along. So what are the latest developments in e-commerce for supply chains? So with product in e-commerce, most sources suggest that the introduction of new products in the supply chain is ever more frequent with e-commerce. Products themselves are less and less standard. It's becoming increasingly difficult through a strategy of lean product economy, economies of scale. Logistics in e-commerce is the main value creator. Without logistics, in particular about the delivery of goods to the customer, the online sales process will be very limited. It's also a source of cost that can reduce the value of the customer. These reasons, without the framework of logistic activity, the most organizational and technological solutions are introduced to improve the operational function of companies as well as their customer service. So we need to look at how we're going to supply chain management e-commerce. In most online shops, the buyers have free choice in the method of purchase, testing, reception, and payment. Thus, they decide to create the value for their own products. This creation of extra value by the thing the consumers always bought the value, bought the money to the supply chain. Now they're trying to create their own value in the way they impact it. And this is impacting supply chains. They are more and more often configured for individual transactions rather than mass transactions. Among social economic trends have started to affect the e-commerce supply chain. Among the fundamental changes affecting the e-chain is character, we'll consider those which concern society, technology, environmental well-being. Each of them influence the others. These include changes in terrorism, digital terrorism, pluralization of saturated developed markets, resource shrinking, development of green technology, innovation in materials engineering, and many others. This is leading to lean. Do we want supply chains that are very, very cost focused, get all the costs out of them, have very little expenses, and maybe to have large stock, to have very few stocks, versus agile, very reactive, more stocks, more expensive, more able to buy. On the basis of the research carried out, we found that companies do not generally have chains that unambiguously fit into lean or agile. It depends on the product and the way the supply chain works. It depends on what storage strategy is needed. So it is difficult to say it's a mixed strategy. It appears that managers don't have a clear strategy. In fact, for instance, the arrival of 3D printing could allow customers to massively influence supply chain configurations. So there are big changes coming down the road that are very important for us to deal with. So, to look at this summary, let's have a look at what we've talked about here. We've talked about the fact that e-commerce, allowing the customer to move all the way into the supply chain, to make influences routed, is fundamentally altering the attitude of the supply chain. And that is what we're doing. So with the things change at the moment, the supply chain, in the process of partnership and the relationships and trust, which we hear repeated, stated constantly, the attitudes have to change. We have to have more long-term expectations. We have to have a sharing of success, because the supply chain is the sole focus of competition. You can, if you squeeze your own suppliers in order to increase your profits, your best bet is actually to work with your suppliers in order to build up trust, in order to make sure that you can gain new customers and new source of value in the supply chain, rather than trying to fight over the supply and value that's already in there. Which means that actions alongside these actions need to be joint problem solving. You need to invest in your own suppliers. If you're the main part of the company, you need to make sure that your supplier has the training, experience, the access to the finance, etc., to buy their own factories. And you need to be open and honest about the situation. If you're going to ask them to take costs to reduce pricing, you can't say you're going to cut your cost by 2% because we're saying. You have to be honest about why that's happening. Do that. So this leads to a situation in which you're looking at things like joint learning. You're looking at joint coordinated activities. And you're actually trying to say specialize in your relationships. Pick those things that are strategically alliance to you, that can align with you, and make sure that you might have few relationships with organizations, but do not simply have a single point of contact. The old system where there might be one person who managed your account is gone. What you need to be able to do is to reach onto the supply chain of the supplier. You need to know what's happening on their production line. You need to know whether they're producing the things that you need so that you can be ready in your factory to adapt and produce with them. Okay, so this compressing the supply chain, this is to reduce supply chain velocity. What effect does it have? Well, supply chain compression will eventually, if we can push the supply chain, velocity is increased because of distance, so maybe you can compress it in time. So you're trying to compress supply chain time. And in suppressing supply chain time, you are overcoming the problems that are being created by the the length and the distance of the supply chain. So what you need to do is try and make sure first, one thing that you can do is you can make those schedule changes impact market faster. You can respond quicker to these, and this should allow revenues to be maximised. So that's one of the things that reduce the time ahead for forecast. So forecast closer to demand time. That's important. This should improve your focus, and it will get rid of the need for safety stocks. Less need for safety stocks. Safety stocks are expensive for that, and therefore what you're trying to do is reduce your stock holding costs. If you can find defects faster, it's easier for you to improve the quality of them, and therefore you can reduce wastage costs. Supply chain, e-commerce management, supply chain, there's communication. If you can talk directly to the production line of your supplier, you can find out the defects that got happening on the plant at the time, instead of having to wait for them to be delivered to you. And once they got to you delivered, they might have been shipped across the country. It might have taken a week. You have to send them back because they're faulty. The second thing you have to do is have new products and services faster to market. We've talked a long time about the product life cycle, the idea that products have a natural lifing and you want to extend them, you want to make that. This, if you can do things faster, bring them out, maybe new products, new services, complete new ones, or even ones that are adaptable. If you've got fewer lost sales from third launched, you can maximize your revenues. And you also reduce risk of obsolescence, which means that far less of your equipment is sold or wasted on discounted sales. So this is a really useful and helpful thing to understand about it. E-commerce has massively affected the supply chain. It's of great importance to us that it has done, and we need to work out ways in which we can use that disruption for the benefit of our organizations and companies.